At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 350 plus programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to retired British Army Colonel Richard Kemp about the controversial Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and whether the media unfairly characterizes Israel's military campaign against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And then we break down the Houthis resuming their attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea, the fight inside the Trump administration over Ukraine aid, and much more. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. We're back from a week off for the July 4th holiday and very happy to be here. There's a lot to get to this week, including a fantastic interview with retired British Army Colonel Richard Kemp, who was just in the Gaza Strip visiting aid sites run by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has become quite a controversial outfit. And we'll break all of that down with Colonel Kemp in just a few minutes. But before we get to that, first things first, as always, Guy, welcome back. And what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be back here with you on the podcast. I'm tracking several things right now, chief among them being the way that the Israel-Iran ceasefire has held. But over the past week, we've seen a renewal of drone and rocket attacks by the Iran-backed Houthi militants targeting commercial ships moving through the Red Sea. The Houthis have sank 2 ships, including a Greek-flagged vessel in recent days. One attacked a Liberian-flagged cargo ship. That was a several-hour-long attack on July 8th. This wave of attacks marks the first time that the Houthis have engaged in this since U.S. military forces conducted a pretty aggressive campaign of airstrikes against the group's Yemen-based facilities and leaders in March. So what does all of this mean right now? The attacks in recent days threaten to undermine the delicate Israel-Iran ceasefire. Remember, Ben, the Houthis have also carried out missile strikes against Israel in recent months as a show of solidarity with both Iran and with Hamas, which also has a history of being supported financially and militarily by the Iranian government. These attacks also threaten to undermine the Trump administration's push for a peace deal between Israel and Hamas. There were talks toward a potential deal this week in Qatar, Ben. But this whole situation now raises the question of whether Trump will order the U.S. military to resume its airstrikes against Houthi targets in Yemen. The U.S. campaign of strikes in March was somewhat secretive, although Pentagon officials claimed it had been successful in decimating the leadership structure of the Houthis. So we're tracking that closely in the Daily Threat Status newsletter, Ben. On a separate front, I was struck this week by a story that first got legs in the French newspaper Le Monde about how extremist groups across West Africa have been exploiting loopholes in using Starlink internet terminals for communications and to spread jihadist propaganda. This is creating a significant security concern for Starlink, the Elon Musk-owned company, as it looks to expand its services to people in Africa. Listeners can find our coverage on the threat status pages at the Washington Times, Ben. The Le Monde report I mentioned noted that a Starlink device mounted on a white tripod was noticed in a June 2024 video from an Al-Qaeda affiliated terror group in Mali. Nigerian authorities have actually seized several Starlink devices during counterterrorism operations in that country. Interestingly, Ben, Starlink terminals, basically, this is what connects somebody or a group in an area without internet to the Starlink satellites that project internet access. The terminals can be purchased for around $500 and maintained with a monthly subscription fee of about $70. While this may seem exorbitant for, say, a village somewhere in rural Nigeria, the reality is that organized jihadist groups can buy the terminals, or at least that's the implication at play here.
Yeah, I mean, Starlink terminals, of course, have been crucial in Ukraine and elsewhere over the past few years. So it's, they can do a lot of good in bringing internet access to populations in areas that otherwise might not have it. But, there's another side to the story that, of course, we'll keep tracking. So thanks for that. And speaking of Ukraine, a lot of other developments in the Russia-Ukraine war over just the past couple of days. On the battlefield, Russia launched another massive drone and missile attack on Ukraine this week. The city of Lutsk took the brunt of the assault, though thankfully casualties, at least as of this taping, are relatively low. Analysts that I talked to this week warned that the Russians are getting better at these kinds of attacks and that it's going to get increasingly more difficult for Ukraine to stop them. And that's, of course, where U.S. aid, military equipment, comes in. President Trump acknowledged this week that Ukraine needs more defensive military equipment from the United States, things like Patriot missile defense batteries, early warning systems, radar sensors, other capabilities. And we should note that Trump said this while also once again expressing his anger with Russian President Putin for seemingly not dealing in good faith when it comes to ceasefire negotiations. But let's drill a little bit deeper into this defensive weapons, U.S. aid aspect, because it really does seem like this is a crucial moment in the war for Ukraine. And if these weapons deliveries stop, it will be disastrous for Ukraine. And they almost did, or at least some of them. Before Trump this week publicly said that the U.S. would give more aid to Ukraine, the Pentagon had paused the delivery of some air defense interceptors, precision-guided bombs, because U.S. stockpiles, the Pentagon said, were running too low. Now, Trump indicated that he didn't know about this in advance. He seemed angry about that, too. So it's worth asking the question, how did this happen? And some Republicans on Capitol Hill want an investigation into how it happened. But I think beneath the surface, there's a real divide in the administration here. And interestingly, Trump now seems to be in the camp of increasing aid to Ukraine. I wonder if Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth agrees. Remember that a few weeks after Hegseth was confirmed earlier this year, he went to a NATO meeting and just unprompted declared that Ukraine would never get all of its territory back. And no one that I talked to could really understand why you would say that before ceasefire talks had really even started. So, and now this. A good source of mine, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst, now at the Atlantic Council, he wrote a really great analysis this week in which he said there are clearly, quote, restrainers, unquote, in the administration and in the MAGA orbit. Clearly, folks like Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson fit into that category. Maybe Hegseth does to one degree or another. John Herbst identified D&I Director Tulsi Gabbard as another figure. Pentagon Policy Chief Elbridge Colby reportedly was at the center of the decision to pause weapons delivery. So he may fall into that category of wanting to restrain the U.S. on its Ukraine aid as well. It's fascinating that all of these people, as recently as a few months ago, were seemingly aligned with Trump on this issue, that the U.S. needed to use aid as leverage to force Ukraine to the table and end the war. It's become increasingly clear Russia doesn't seem interested in peace. And now in this kind of ironic twist of fate, Trump is developing what could be seen as kind of a hawkish streak on Ukraine. And don't forget that he also ordered the bombing of Iranian nuclear sites just a few weeks ago. And as you mentioned, Guy, authorized a massive bombing campaign against the Houthis back in March. So I have to be honest, Guy, this whole episode over the past few days was a twist in the Ukraine story that I didn't really expect to see.
Yes, Ben, a lot of twists and turns. I was literally just chatting with Guillaume Patak, our special threat status correspondent in Ukraine. He sent me some videos of Russian nighttime attacks from the other night. Hopefully we will have Guillaume back on the podcast soon. Ben, everything you said is on the money, I think. Remember that Trump on the campaign trail said he was going to end the war in a month. And we've seen fits and starts of talks over the past 6 months. The process is essentially stalled and hasn't gained momentum. There are signs that there could be a third round of direct meetings between Ukrainian and Russian officials. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio brought it up during a press conference on July 10 in Malaysia, basically just as we were taping this episode, Ben, where Rubio had actually met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Rubio is there attending a summit of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Anyway, Rubio said he and Lavrov discussed new ideas for how to get Ukraine-Russia talks going. But he didn't give much detail. And I think that the really big question, Ben, is how does the rare earth mineral extraction deal that the Trump administration pushed and struck with the Ukrainian government, this involves eastern Ukrainian areas that are actually occupied by Russian military forces. How will that be a potential factor in behind-the-scenes deal-making with Moscow over trying to end its more than 3-year-old assault on Ukraine?
Yeah, that is interesting, Guy. That's something we're obviously going to keep an eye on here at Threat Status.
One more thing I wanted to note, Ben, on a totally different front, was the U.S. Justice Department announcement in recent days that 2 Chinese nationals and a New York woman had pleaded guilty to money laundering charges as part of a major Chinese drug operation with ties to Mexican drug cartels involving shipping into the U.S. the deadly fentanyl synthetic opioid that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans over the past several years. Our own Bill Gertz covered this closely in Threat Status, Ben, writing that the money laundering operation took bulk cash from drug trafficking and deposited it into banks. This was an interesting case, Ben. I want to note that I sat down last year at the Brookings Institution with Vonda Felbob Brown for a whole Threat Status influencers video interview about Chinese organized criminal activity in Mexico. That video is on the Threat Status pages at the Washington Times, and it's still very relevant.
We are joined now by Colonel Richard Kemp, a retired British Army officer with a long and distinguished career spanning 30 years from the Cold War era through the War on Terror era. He served in Afghanistan, Iraq, elsewhere around the world, and has extensive experience in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations. Colonel Kemp was recently in the Gaza Strip, and he saw up close the aid distribution sites being operated by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is a U.S. and Israel-backed organization created earlier this year to distribute aid to the Palestinians in Gaza. It gets some funding from the State Department, but it's also quite a controversial organization, which we'll get to in just a moment. But Colonel Kemp, for starters, thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Status podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Of course. Let's start there, because the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has been in the news quite a bit over the past few months, and it's come under some intense criticism. Just before we came on here, I looked up and saw that Amnesty International calls it an illegitimate and inhumane aid scheme that risks violating international law. There have been any number of allegations against the group from critics who say its security at these sites has fired on Palestinian civilians, which the GHF, of course, denies. We should mention last week there was a grenade attack at a site in southern Gaza in which 2 GHF workers were injured. The U.S. and Israel blamed Hamas for that. So all of that by way of background, just to get to this, you were there and we weren't. And I think most, if not all of our listeners haven't been there. So what did you see? Is this a lawless, chaotic aid distribution scheme run by scary guys with guns, as some in the media would have us believe? Or did you see something else?
I saw something quite different. In the last 2 weeks, I visited 2 Gaza Humanitarian Foundation humanitarian aid distribution sites inside Gaza. These sites are protected by the GHF, which is made up mainly of former American servicemen with a lot of combat experience, armed, of course, and then externally protected by the IDF some distance away from the sites. but guarding the perimeters. And what I saw, I was there in each of these sites. I was there while huge amounts of food were distributed to thousands upon thousands of Gazan civilians who came willingly to these sites, who were very, very grateful for what they saw, who arrived, they took what they needed, and they left. And yes, you use the word chaotic. There is an element of chaos there because the GHF staff, they want to let it be free-flowing to avoid any confrontation or clashes between them and Gazan civilians. So it's kind of like if you opened up the doors of Walmart in New York and said everything in here is free, you'd get similar scenes, people coming in, taking what they need and getting out. There was a warm relationship between the GHF staff and the Gazan civilians. They do use local civilians employed by the GHF as a kind of interface, but there was a warm relationship. I spoke to at least 100 Gazan civilians coming to get aid during the time as I was at the two sites. And the things I heard most from them, talking to them, were one, I love America and I love Trump, because, of course, they associate these sites with America. And the second thing I heard was, I hate Hamas, kill Hamas. These were the major refrains. And particularly when people said, I hate Hamas, there were cheers from those around them who heard what they said. So this is the reality. In many cases, people told me, Gazans told me, for the first time, they'd received free aid since the war began. Because up until now, up until the GHF started working, and they've delivered, I think they've distributed something in the region of 60 million meals in the 6 weeks they've been operating. I think they're aiming now to distribute 2 million meals a day, a phenomenal figure, really, for a relatively small operation. Up until they started operating, Hamas would seize most of the aid brought in by the UN and other humanitarian organizations, and then sell it at a premium price in the markets, which many Gazans can't afford to do. So I saw a lot of smiling faces, a lot of very, very happy Gazans in both of those sites.
I don't want to put you in a position to be a media critic here, but I've kind of a two-part question here, and I think you're in a unique position to answer it. You've seen some of the reporting, of course, over the past few weeks, and just this week, Reuters issued a correction after it ran a story citing a written proposal documents that it said it had seen laying out plans for, quote, humanitarian transit areas, unquote, essentially a plan to relocate Gazans out of the Gaza Strip, as President Trump has suggested. It does seem like there are some plans out there to do this, but the GHF denied that it had any direct links to that plan, and Reuters issued a correction saying it couldn't verify who, in fact, wrote that specific proposal. But two things. Number one, from where you sit, do you get the sense that some folks in the media are eager to discredit the GHF, with examples like that and many others? And then as a follow-up on that broader question, logistically speaking, even setting aside the moral and geopolitical implications of this for a moment, is it feasible, practical, in your view, to relocate even a majority of Palestinians out of Gaza?
Yeah, I don't mind being a media critic. I spend a lot of time with the media, and they've got a lot to answer for. Not all media, of course, but there's a huge anti-Israel bias, and of course anti-America and anti-Trump bias in parts of the media. And that, I think, means that they're going to criticize any initiative like this, no matter its good or bad points. And the GHF admit they're not perfect, but they're certainly not illegitimate. They're certainly not guilty of what they're being accused of. I think the main reason why, apart from inbuilt bias in some media organizations, the main reason why there is such opposition and enmity towards the GHF is because of the United Nations. The United Nations have utterly condemned the GHF, and of course they are very big opinion formers, as are established aid organizations like Amnesty International that you mentioned before. And there's something that really is quite a stark observation, I think, but it's true. The two main opponents of the GHF, the two main opponents are Hamas. Quite understandable. We know what, taking control from them. They don't want anything to do with this. They hate it. They have killed Gazans who have been involved in GHF sites in the past. And secondly, the second main opponent is the United Nations. Now, that does take some sinking in, I think, because the United Nations and Hamas speaking in unison against the GHF, that really does tell you a big story. And on to the second part of your question. Is it feasible or possible to move people out, or the majority of people out of Gaza? The answer is yes, it is. If you think about it, the population of Gaza is 2 million people approximately. When Russia invaded Ukraine, around 2 million people moved from Ukraine into Poland, into neighboring Poland, almost immediately. Millions moved elsewhere as well. Now, no one said that was ethnic cleansing because it didn't involve Israel, which is automatically, by definition, is, according to some, is guilty of ethnic cleansing. So it is logistically possible. And the other thing, I told you about some of the stuff that the Gazan civilians said to me. The other thing many of them said was, we just want to get out of Gaza. As soon as we can, we want to leave Gaza. They see no future for themselves in a place that is basically a demolition site. It's been bombed, it's been blown up, it's been rubberized, it's got a huge substructure of tunnels underneath it, which cause collapse of buildings. There are booby traps in among the ruins. Who could live there? No one can actually live there now. So the practical solution is to do what the Gazans actually want and let them move out. Those who want to stay, well, they can stay and do their best to live there.
Richard, it's Guy Taylor. There are big questions about where Palestinians from Gaza would go, given that in the region there are very few governments that would give Palestinians any kind of citizenship to allow them to move freely around the region. Is that something that you see that there could actually be progress towards allowing people to move beyond Israel, perhaps into Jordan, perhaps into Egypt, or is that just a stalemate that can't be resolved?
Well, I heard Prime Minister Netanyahu the other day saying that some Arab countries and some other countries perhaps are willing to take Gazans. I don't know how many. I don't know whether that is actually a concrete situation. But the obvious place for most Gazans to go is Egypt. Next door, they share a border with Gaza. One thing that has really struck me throughout this conflict is that Egypt has built its border stronger. It hasn't done anything to open its gates to let the Gazans in. And that's unprecedented in warfare, I think. I don't know of any other case where a neighboring safe country has refused admittance to civilians who are in danger in a war zone. It happens in pretty much every conflict. Now, in some ways, I can understand Egypt's problems. Egypt doesn't want to bring this problem on itself. What I find hard to understand is the lack of pressure on Egypt from the international community. Normally, they'd be demanding Egypt open the borders, but they're not. They haven't been. And you've got to ask the question why. And my view is they want to use the international community, talking generally, they want to use Gazan civilians in the same way as Hamas do, as human shields, keep them in Gaza and prevent Israel from achieving its objectives in Gaza.
Let me ask you just about your personal experience, and I want to back up again here. You've served in basically 2 decades in the British military. You've been in some of the most challenging environments in the world. When it comes to distributing aid in Gaza and this mission, how does that compare to some of the past places you've been, particularly with regard to protecting innocent Palestinian civilians?
Well, there's a lot of lies told about this, but I've seen it with my own eyes inside Gaza, and I've been to places like Fallujah, Mosul, and Bakhmut in Ukraine, which are basically comparable battlefields in terms of the level of destruction and loss of civilian life, certainly in Mosul and Fallujah, that we've seen in Gaza. The place is the most complex battlefield any army has ever had to fight on. And that's due to a number of things. First of all, the very dense civilian population used as human shields by Hamas. Hamas always fight from within the civilian population. Secondly, the tunnel system. And the tunnel system is extremely extensive. It's bigger than the London Underground. These are very, very complex, sophisticated tunnels, which are very, very hard for the IDF to penetrate and fight through, but they've achieved it. And the third factor, I think, which I did touch on, is the use by Hamas of human shields. Hamas want the civilian population or they want civilians in Gaza to die at the hands of the IDF, because that enables them to bring down vitriol, isolation, hatred of Israel, which we've seen, all backed up by incorrect media reporting as well. There's a big difference, for example, between Bakhmut in Ukraine and Gaza, because in Bakhmut, it was uniformed army against uniformed army. In Gaza, it's terrorists in civilian clothes, moving from building to building, weapons stashes in every building. They don't even have to carry weapons in the open. And so it's a very tough battlefield that the IDF had to fight on. And I think they fought on that battlefield with great effectiveness and particularly with great care for the civilian population.
That's what I want to ask you. I mean, there has been this relentless Israeli bombing campaign over nearly 2 years. How would you grade the job of the Israeli Defense Forces? Critics accuse the IDF essentially of conducting a genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. We've reported at Threat Status that most of the statistics about casualties coming from Gaza are done by the Gaza Health Ministry, which is controlled by Hamas. But it can be hard to get accurate information about casualties. You've been there. You've seen the IDF up close. From your perspective, how good of a job have they done at executing their military mission while minimizing civilian casualties?
Well, it's a very tough job, and I've seen them doing it very effectively. And they use a huge range of measures that I don't think any other army could use, and certainly has not used in the past, to try and kill their enemy while minimizing the danger to civilians. And that includes a range of operations like voice messages, text messages, leaflet drops, radio messages, numerous other means that they use to try and prevent civilian deaths. Now, when you see that, the talk of a genocide is it's an obscenity to accuse Israel of genocide. It's actually Hamas, starting on the 7th of October, or before that actually, that tried to carry out a genocide against the Jews in Israel. My calculation, these are not hard and fast figures, but by my calculation, I think the total number of civilian casualties caused by the IDF, and every casualty, by the way, is the direct responsibility of Hamas, who started this war. But the total number of civilian casualties is one civilian to every one combatant. That sounds bad, and it is very bad. But if you look at Afghanistan, the estimated ratio, civilian to combatant, was 5-1, 5 civilians for every combatant killed by the US and its allies. In Iraq, it was something like 3-1. So terrible though these figures are, when you look at the environment they're fighting in, the IDF have achieved something I don't think any other army could have achieved. And I've been into Gaza with other senior retired military officers from around the world who agree totally and have gone on record as agreeing with that, despite the lies of Hamas and the distortions of the media.
Let's end with this, because I think everything we've kind of talked about sort of, leads up to this question, because right now there are negotiations in Qatar between Israel and Hamas delegations. And President Trump, of course, is pushing very hard and very publicly to get a ceasefire deal, which would get the remaining hostages held by Hamas released. Where do you come down on this, the basic idea of negotiations with everything we've just talked about with Hamas and how they want civilians to be killed, how they distort the truth, where their agenda really is? Do you think it's fundamentally a mistake by Israel or by anybody to think that you can negotiate in good faith with a group like that?
Before I answer that question, just one other point I'd like to note in relation to the previous point that I made. Not only has the IDF done their best to minimize civilian casualties, but also they've done their best to get humanitarian aid into Gaza. To my knowledge, no other army in history has, while fighting an enemy on the same terrain, has done so much to get humanitarian aid into the civilian population on the enemy side on that same terrain. That's, I think, is unheard of. And as a result of that, far more calories per person have been delivered into Gaza during this war than were delivered in a comparable period before the war began. So I just wanted to make that point, which I think is pretty important when you consider Israel's being accused of not only unlawful killing of civilians, but also of deliberate starvation. As to your question, I think it's wrong to assume you can negotiate in good faith with Hamas any more than you could negotiate in good faith with Iran over its nuclear weapons. I have big problems with these negotiations, but I can understand at the same time, having spent most of the time since 7th of October 23 inside Israel, the strength of feeling for the hostages. Now, I think we can all really sympathize with those hostages and feel very, very sorry for what's happening to them, what's been happening to them. But it's a really important point, above all, for Israel as a country. And they will, I think, do almost anything to get those hostages out. And that does include having a pause in the fighting and also releasing Hamas terrorists, which has happened in the past. And these negotiations have worked in the past, despite Hamas's ill dealings. And it's partly as a result of military pressure, which has driven Hamas into negotiations. But we have seen hostages freed. And I would hope, and it's the only reason I believe why negotiations should proceed, in the hope of getting at least some more of the hostages out. But the priority, in my view, as well as that, is that Hamas must be destroyed and prevented from regaining control of Gaza. And so, yes, negotiate to release hostages and then return to the fight to finish off Hamas.
Okay. Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks, it's my pleasure.
It's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security this week, as you all are listening to the show. And my threat of the week is that the U.S. doesn't seem to be able to fully cooperate effectively with its allies on space operations. We talk a lot about interoperability on this show, the idea of the U.S. military being able to operate almost seamlessly in a military capacity with NATO partners like Britain, Canada, France, or military such as Israel and South Korea. But that cooperation seems to stop once you get into orbit, at least according to a recent Government Accountability Office report. Our colleague and Washington Times military correspondent Mike Glenn wrote about this week. The GAO report said, quote, the U.S. Space Force doesn't have enough people in some units to plan and execute activities with allies and partners, unquote. And here's what really jumped out to me. The GAO report said that several foreign government officials said that they have a hard time finding out who in the DoD they should coordinate with and talk to about space operations. Now, if you talk to Space Force officials and folks who advocate on behalf of that service, such as the Space Force Association, they'll tell you that the Space Force needs a bigger budget. And that may be true. It's only been around a few years, but the Space Force is by far the smallest of the military branches. But I do wonder if there might be something deeper going on here, and that is just that military operations in space are really complicated and very, very new. Of course, there's never been a war fought in space, so it's not like we have a wealth of experience in the Pentagon or really anywhere else about battlefield doctrines and allied interoperability in low Earth orbit or beyond. So we'll actually get into some of this a little bit next week on space and the idea of budgets and where money and resources should go on the space front. But for now, Guy, this is my threat of the week because it's something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but it's going to be really important in the years to come.
Interesting, Ben. My threat of the week is that Russian and Chinese military forces are collaborating increasingly in joint fighter jet and bomber patrols, basically at unprecedented levels. A report published in recent days by the U.S. Air Force's China Aerospace Studies Institute and the Japanese Air Self-Defense Forces Air and Space Studies Institute highlighted how these joint patrols essentially amount to practices for a strategic nuclear attack on the United States. This does not mean that such an attack will ever actually happen, Ben, but the point is, and our own Bill Gertz actually covered this in his weekly Inside the Ring column on July 9, Ben. The point is that there have been 9 joint Chinese-Russian bomber flights since 2019. Most of them were non-threatening, including a July 2024 strategic bomber patrol near Alaska. But that all changed in November when China's People's Liberation Army Air Force used H-6N bombers with Russian Tu-95 bombers within range of Guam. This is my threat of the week, Ben. It's something that U.S. military and intelligence agencies are no doubt closely tracking.
Yeah, speaking of interoperability, right? This increasing military cooperation between China and Russia, among others. So that's something worth keeping an eye on. Thank you for that. And a huge thanks to Colonel Richard Kemp for walking us through what the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is actually doing on the ground in the Gaza Strip. And a huge thanks to all of you, of course, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.